think we're ready to get started. I'm Paul Pearson. I'm the director of the Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative. I'm really happy to have everybody here. But just before we start, one quick announcement, and then I'll introduce our speaker and discussant. I guess it's kind of British Invasion Month, because on Tuesday, Diane Coyle is going to be here from the University of Cambridge. 1 o'clock, she's going to be talking, the title of her talk is Economics Automated. I think it's going to be really fascinating. But today, we've got Daniel Chandler, who's coming to us from the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he's the research director of the program on cohesive capitalism. And I have a little quote here about what that program is about, and I thought, well, this could have also been written about BESI. It's described as a multidisciplinary initiative to investigate new politico-economic paradigms, institutions, and policies that could serve the common interest. Very nice summary. He's the author of Free and Equal, A Mandate for a Just Society. He's got a copy there to show us. And after Daniel gives his opening remarks for 35 minutes or so, we're going to hear from Brian Judge, who's here at Berkeley, policy fellow at the Center for Human Compatible AI, and the author of Democracy in Default, which is a book we're going to hear about on November 14th, so just in a few weeks. So Daniel, thanks so much for coming. The floor is yours.
Okay. Is it amplified in this room, or is it? Anyway, you can all hear me, fine. Okay, great, thanks. Thanks, Paul and everyone at BESI for having me over for this talk. And Brian, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts too. So I thought I would talk a bit about my motivation for writing the book and then kind of run through some of the ideas so that we'll all kind of have the basis for a discussion when I'm done. I guess I had 3 overlapping aims in writing the book. The first was to try to rehabilitate liberalism as a distinctively progressive public philosophy. Second was to introduce Rawls to a wider audience and to try to connect his ideas with a practical agenda. And then third, to try and provide the intellectual basis for a broad-based and genuinely transformative progressive politics. And I should say, as that description probably makes or sort of suggests already, that the book is aimed at a popular rather than an academic audience. And the intention for the book is as much political as it is intellectual. That said, I think it also tries to make a serious intellectual contribution by extending and applying the quite abstract philosophy of John Rawls and trying to connect it to a whole range of practical questions. So I thought I'd say a bit more about those 3 aims to get us started. So first, on rehabilitating liberalism, I guess in popular discourse and public policy, particularly on the left, I think liberalism has come to be associated with neoliberalism, with an idea of people and society that's grounded in self-interest and competition, and a vision of the role of the state that's fundamentally about protecting economic freedoms and enabling markets in order to promote economic growth. And I think that those ideas have largely failed on their own terms, in the sense that they haven't obviously promoted economic growth in the way that they intended to, and have also been responsible for a sharp increase in inequality that I think is at the root of a lot of the political challenges that we're facing today. But I think, just in this same period in which neoliberalism has come to dominate political discourse and economic policy, liberal political theory has moved in almost the opposite direction, mostly under the influence of John Rawls. And I think the result is a kind of disconnect between popular conceptions of liberalism and the leading edge of liberal political theory today. And so one of the aims of the book was to try to bring popular understandings of liberalism up to date, in a sense, and also to make a wholehearted case for a liberalism that's grounded not in self-interest and competition, but in reciprocity and cooperation, and which also points towards a different economic paradigm or a different set of economic institutions. So, as I mentioned before, Rawls has been the kind of leading figure in this shift in liberal political philosophy in recent decades. And that brings me back to the second aim, which was to try to introduce Rawls to a wider audience and connect his ideas to a practical agenda. It's kind of hard to overstate Rawls's influence within academic political philosophy. I have a quote to illustrate this from another prominent political philosopher, Jerry Cohen, who wrote in 2009, without any caveats, that there are, quote, at most 2 books in the history of Western political philosophy that have a claim to be regarded as greater than a theory of justice, which is Rawls's most famous book, published in 1971, Plato's Republic and Hobbes's Leviathan. So I think that sort of gives you a sense of the standing in which Rawls is held within academic political philosophy. But I think outside of the academy, he's had relatively little influence, much less so than his contemporaries, like some of his contemporaries more on the sort of classical liberal or right-wing end of the liberal spectrum, like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. It was partly a reflection of Rawls's personality, who was an extremely shy and modest man, famously so, and did not have any desire to play the role of public intellectual. He almost never got engaged in topical controversies of his day. He didn't write op-eds. He gave almost no interviews in his lifetime. So I think it's partly that Rawls himself didn't make much effort to promote his ideas in the broader public sphere outside of academia. I think it's partly about the political context in which his ideas emerged, that just as his ideas were coming to dominate academic political theory in the 70s and 80s, real politics was moving in the opposite direction. And I think it would be too much to think that one thinker could have stood in the way of that. But I also think one important reason why Rawls has had less impact on public policy than he might is that he said so little about what his ideas would imply in practice. And again, that's one of the aims of my book as both economist as well as philosopher, is to try to pick up where Rawls left off and really take his ideas seriously as the basis for a practical agenda for how we might reorganize our political and economic institutions. That is a project that obviously involves going well beyond Rawls's own writing and trying to engage seriously with the evidence about how different institutions might actually work in practice and which ones would best achieve his principles. So yes, I've talked a bit about rehabilitating liberalism, introducing Rawls to a wider audience. And I suppose in a sense, those goals they're partly intellectual, but also political, in the sense that I think that Rawls's ideas can help provide an intellectual basis for a broad-based progressive and liberal politics. And the book it's not a party political book, but I did write it in a sense with mainstream progressive parties like the Democrats in the US or the Labour Party in the UK in mind. And I think that those parties have really struggled to articulate a coherent vision or philosophy, a sense of what they stand for in recent decades, and that lack of vision is not just a problem for people like us who are interested in ideas. I think it's also been a real obstacle to electoral success and to building durable political coalitions, and that part of the problem is a lack of intellectual reference points, that whereas Reagan and Thatcher could look to thinkers like Hayek and Friedman in the 1980s, it's not as clear where we might look today for fresh inspiration. And I think part of my motivation for writing the book was that a lot of the literature that's responding to the so-called crisis of liberal democracy has been either diagnostic or technocratic. That diagnostic in the sense that there have been lots of books, and lots of really great books, that look at how and why we've ended up in the situation that we're in, where there is, genuine and I think potentially existential threats to liberal democracy in the form of authoritarian populism. So yeah, books about how and why we've ended up in that situation, but where practical ideas for what we ought to do about it tend to get squeezed into a final chapter and don't feel like they amount to, that they match up to the scale of the challenges that we face. And then technocratic in the sense that books that do take up a policy agenda often present policy ideas mostly as technical fixes to specific problems, and they often feel disconnected from any broader philosophy. And I guess one of the ideas or the premises for the book is that Rawls's ideas in particular provide a kind of missing piece of the puzzle, that having a coherent philosophy that can tie different policy ideas together is something that's both intellectually and politically valuable. So that's the kind of broad motivation for the book. In terms of just how it's structured, there's a first part to the book that's essentially what I hope is an accessible introduction to Rawls's ideas. I just go through the principles, the detail of his argument for them, and try to respond to some of the common criticisms that have been leveled at his ideas from the left, from the right, from communitarians, and from kind of so-called realist critics who argue that the focus on ideal institutions is just too abstract to be useful in real politics. And then there's a second part of the book, which is really the sort of bulk of the material, which, as I've said before, really tries to connect Rawls's ideas to a practical agenda. So I thought I would just give a sort of overview, I guess, of both parts of the book, starting with a kind of brief Rawls recap for anyone who hasn't revisited his ideas recently. So the starting point for Rawls's philosophy is the idea that society is not just a collection of atomized individuals pursuing their own self-interest, but what he calls a fair system of social cooperation. And he describes that, or a fair system of social cooperation between free and equal citizens. He describes that as the fundamental idea of his theory. It's not an idea that he tries to... Oh, I think Siri just... sorry. Sorry, my computer just made a kind of sound as if I was speaking to it. Where was I? So, a fair system of social cooperation. That's the fundamental idea of Rawls's theory. He doesn't try to justify it from first principles. He argues that that just is an idea that is very deep in the public culture of existing democratic societies, that it's an idea that many people recognize and find intuitively compelling, and that makes it a reasonable basis for thinking about a set of principles that could organize democratic discourse and debate. But of course, it's also a vague idea and one that's open to many different interpretations. And so one of Rawls's most famous contributions was to develop this thought experiment, which he called the original position, the purpose of which is to move us from this vague but intuitive idea of fair cooperation towards a set of principles that we can actually use to think about how to design our social and political institutions. And the thought experiment, which I'm sure many of you will be aware of, is that if we want to know what a fair society would look like or what fair cooperation would entail, we should try to imagine the principles that we would choose to organize those institutions if we didn't know what our position in society would be. So whether we would be rich or poor, gay or straight, black or white, as if behind what he called a veil of ignorance. And I think it's a very powerful and intuitive way to think about fairness. In a sense, it's a kind of secular interpretation of the golden rule, the idea that we should do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I think that's an idea that's found in many religious and cultural traditions. I think that's part of why the idea has potentially such broad appeal, at least on an intuitive level. I think that the difference between Rawls's interpretation of that notion and the conventional golden rule that you find in religious and cultural traditions is that it's often, I think typically it's thought of as a way of thinking about relationships between individuals, how it is that you should treat your friends and family and colleagues. And what Rawls does is try to apply that same way of thinking to how we organize the basic structure, as he calls it, of society, our core political and economic institutions. So Rawls uses that thought experiment to make the case for his two fundamental principles of justice, one to do with freedom, one to do with equality, hence the title of the book, Free and Equal. I won't sort of dwell on the details of the argument from the thought experiment to the principles. We could come back to that in the discussion, but instead I just thought I would run through the principles so that we're all on the same page. So first, he argues that we would choose what he calls the basic liberties principle, which is a commitment to protect a set of truly fundamental freedoms that include both personal freedoms like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of thought, freedom of bodily autonomy, but also political freedoms. And his idea of political freedom is a particularly demanding one. It's not just formal political freedoms like the right to vote or freedom of political speech and assembly. He argues that we have a fundamental right to not just formal freedoms, but to what he calls the fair value of those freedoms. The idea is that we need to have a political system that gives people a genuinely equal chance to influence and take part in the democratic process. And I'll come back a bit later to what that might mean in practice. And I guess a distinctive thing about Rawls's basic liberties principle is that it only includes a quite narrow set of economic freedoms. And this is one of the areas where he departs from the classical liberal and libertarian traditions. So for Rawls, some economic freedoms are truly fundamental. Those include a right to personal property, so to own clothing and housing, to have a space of your own, but not to private ownership of the means of production more broadly. So a right to own personal property, that's truly fundamental, as is freedom of occupational choice. And the idea is that those freedoms are essential for us to exercise the capacities that are most essential to us as individuals and as citizens, the capacities to develop and pursue an idea of how we want to live and to engage with democratic politics and have a sense of justice, as he calls it. So that's his first freedom principle, sets out this list of fundamental freedoms that the state needs to protect as its kind of first priority. And then he has a second equality principle that's got two parts. The first is what he called fair equality of opportunity, and that's not just the absence of discrimination, but a commitment to making sure that everyone has a genuinely equal chance to develop their talents and abilities in life. And then he combines that with the difference principle, which is the most well-known and innovative and also radical aspect of his theory, which is the idea that inequalities can be justified in society only where they ultimately benefit others, and specifically that inequalities we should organize our economic system so that the least well-off are better off than they would be under any alternative. So we can make use of, we can recognize the value of markets and the importance of incentives in generating innovation and encouraging economic growth, but we need to make sure that those benefits are harnessed, that those benefits are widely shared, and the difference principle tries to give us a more precise and egalitarian definition of just how widely shared those benefits should be. And another, I think, a crucial feature of the difference principle that's often been overlooked, and which I'll also come back to later, is that it's not just meant to apply to the distribution of income and wealth. For Rawls, economic justice is also about the distribution of positions of power and control, including, for example, the balance of power between workers and owners, and what he calls the social bases of self-respect, within which access to meaningful work has a particularly important role. So that's the kind of quick overview of Rawls's theory, the two core principles. There's also actually a third principle that Rawls didn't give as much attention to, and which has often been overlooked in the discussion of his ideas, but which I think is particularly relevant now, which he called the just savings principle. And it's a principle of intergenerational justice. And although when Rawls was thinking about intergenerational justice, he was mostly thinking about the obligations that one generation have to save in order that future generations might be better off. But the principle also applies in a very natural way to questions about sustainability. And it effectively implies a commitment to a form of sustainable development that present generations have, at the very least, an obligation to maintain the ecological resources on which a stable and just society depends. So just, I guess, to me, a couple of things that stand out about those principles. First is their kind of breadth of scope, that they give you one unified framework for thinking about an enormously wide range of questions, encompassing questions about individual freedom, free speech, the organization of the political process, equality of opportunity, through to questions about the structure of our economic system and the degree to which it's sustainable too. So there's I think the breadth of scope. There's the fact that the sort of constructive intent of the theory, that Rawls doesn't just pose the question of what a just society would look like. He tries to give an answer, or at least a set of principles working out an answer. I also think it's a theory that helps to overcome some of the false dichotomies that often exist within debates about liberal thought between freedom and equality, between caring about equality of opportunity and having an interest in the fairness of outcomes, and also between a narrow focus on money and then a wider concern for the nature of social relationships, questions about power, dignity, and respect. I think that Rawls's theory shows us that all of these things matter and helps to provide a coherent way for thinking about how all these things can fit together in a coherent way. So, as I've already said, one of the sort of limitation of Rawls's own writing is that he said so little about what the practical implications of these principles might be. And so that kind of brings me back to the second part of the book. And there are 5 chapters in the second part of the book. I thought I'll just sort of quickly name check some of the sort of list of topics in case we want to come back to them later, and then say a little bit more about 2 of them. So first I have a chapter looking at questions to do with individual freedom. So questions about how to deal with clashes between fundamental freedoms like free speech, clashes between religious freedom and the rights of LGBT communities. Then I also look at the kinds of institutions we need to protect those freedoms, the role of written constitutions and an independent judiciary, and then also trying to recognize that institutions alone will never be enough to protect those truly fundamental liberties, and that there needs to be that there is space for a more active role for the state, both in fostering a sense of shared values and also of shared identity. And I go into some detail in discussing the importance of civic education within that, and also a form of liberal patriotism. Then I have a chapter about political equality and the democratic process, which I'll come back to in a moment. A third chapter looking at equality of opportunity that's broken down into questions to do with class, race, and gender. And then 2 final chapters exploring what a kind of economic system inspired by Rawls's principles might look like. So I thought I would say a bit more both about questions to do with political equality and democratic institutions, and then come to the economic ideas. So on political equality, I think that, as I said before, Rawls's basic liberties principle is not just meant to be a guarantee of formal political freedoms, but of substantively equal opportunities to influence and take part in the democratic process. And Rawls, he doesn't say that much, even at a conceptual level, about what that kind of political equality depends on. And so one thing I try to do in the book is to flesh out this idea of political equality using some of the conceptual framework developed by Robert Dahl. And part of that is recognizing that first, political equality depends on voting equality, on having equal rights to vote, on votes counting equally, having frequent opportunities to exercise that right to vote. That's the kind of most obvious precondition for genuine political equality. But democracy also obviously isn't only about voting, it's also about a much broader process of persuasion and deliberation, and the equality in that wider process depends on 2 things, which Dahl refers to as the first being what he calls enlightened understanding, basically having an equal opportunity to learn about policies and their likely consequences, that kind of that knowledge is essential for people to be able to exercise their to participate in democratic politics on an equal basis. So enlightened understanding, and then also effective participation, Dahl refers to, which is about having an equal chance to make your voice heard in the wider process of democratic deliberation and debate. And I think in practical terms, in a large modern democracy, those opportunities to participate in the wider process of democratic debate depend on a couple of core institutions, which Jan Wennermuller refers to as the critical infrastructure of democracy, specifically political parties and the news media. And I think that if we want one of I think where Rawls is, where this principle of political equality points us toward thinking much more carefully about how we might design those institutions in a way that they are not so heavily dominated by those who have a lot of financial resources. So looking at political parties in particular, I think the most obvious problem there is the role of private money in funding political parties. That's actually also one of the few practical questions that Rawls himself commented on directly, arguing for limits on private donations and some form of public funding. And in the book, I argued that the best system for addressing this kind of challenge would be something like the democracy voucher scheme that exists in Seattle now for municipal and local elections, where you would have a very low cap on private donations to political parties, and then a form of public funding where every citizen gets an equal amount of money per year or per election cycle that they could give to the party of their choice. I think that's a system that follows in a very direct way from the basic democratic principle of political equality, and one that would really transform the incentives of our political systems. I think that would be the sort of place that I would start, tackling the role of private money in politics. I also look in the book at the case for incorporating forms of direct and participatory democracy into our electoral or into our democratic institutions. And the idea is that, even an ideal form of electoral democracy has its limitations as a mechanism for achieving political equality, that elected officials will always have a degree of discretionary power, and that there will always be a tendency for elected officials to become detached from their constituents, and that forms of participatory and deliberative democracy can provide a counterbalance to some of the limitations of a purely electoral system. So I look in the book at make the case for forms of participatory budgeting at a local level, and for trying to incorporate forms of random selection and citizens' assemblies into democratic politics at a national level. And I discuss those things in more detail in the book, but the broad idea is that a form of mixed democracy that combines electoral with more deliberative and participatory mechanisms can get us closer to the ideal of political equality than any one of those schemes on their own. Coming to the economic ideas, I think that's actually the area where Rawls's philosophy has been most misunderstood, but also where I think his philosophy has the most, in some sense, to offer our discourse today. So Rawls is often interpreted as really just an advocate for a much more generous welfare state, for redistributing money, for sort of maximizing the size of the economic pie and then redistributing money to the least well off. I think that's the conventional interpretation of Rawls's philosophy, both in some philosophical discussion and very much so in economics departments, where if you ever learn about Rawls in economics, it comes up in the context of optimal tax theory. Rawls is sort of reduced to just the Rawlsian social welfare function, which is basically the idea that you should maximize the income of the least well-off individual. And I think this seriously misunderstands Rawls's ideas. Rawls explicitly rejected what he referred to as welfare state capitalism, in favor of either what he referred to as a property-owning democracy or a form of liberal socialism. And what those two systems have in common is that both maintain a very central role for markets, But rather than compensating for the inequalities that markets generate, the aim is to structure our economy so that citizens have access to productive resources and opportunities in a much more equal way. In a property-owning democracy, the idea is that that would be achieved through a much more equal distribution of human capital and of ownership of physical capital. And in liberal socialism, the idea is that that can come through forms of worker ownership or forms of public ownership. And there's lots of debate in the academic literature about Rawls over exactly which ideal type of economic system is the one that best fits his principles. There's debate about whether he was right to reject welfare state socialism, whether property-owning democracy is the best model, or whether really he should have endorsed liberal socialism. And I actually think we shouldn't get too hung up on this debate about ideal types, that way of thinking narrows the set of options that we face in an unhelpful way, and that the range of options open to us is much broader than that. We can combine elements of these different ideal types in lots of different ways, and that what's more useful about Rawls's thinking on economic questions are the reasons why he thinks that redistribution alone isn't enough. And I think there's two things worth highlighting. The first is the importance of reciprocity within Rawls's philosophy, that economic justice for Rawls involves citizens making a fair contribution to economic life in return for a fair reward, and the difference principle is meant to define what that fair reward would look like. And a worry with a purely redistributive model is that it can undermine that sense of reciprocity that's really at the heart of his philosophy. The second thing, which I mentioned before, is that for Rawls, economic justice isn't just about the distribution of money. It's also about the distribution of power and control, the social bases of self-respect. And from that perspective, the problem with redistribution, well, there are a number of problems. The first is that the welfare state as we know it, in its kind of targeted and conditional form, can directly undermine people's self-respect through intrusive forms of means testing. It also doesn't sufficiently provide people with opportunities for work, which itself is an important source of self-respect. And it also doesn't do anything to address questions about the appropriate balance of power between workers and owners that are also an important implication of Rawls's principles. And I think it's this sort of broadening of our conception of inequality and the kinds of inequality that matter that's sort of most interesting and compelling about Rawls's ideas. And I think it's the neglect of questions to do with power, dignity, and self-respect that is an important part of the frustration with our political discourse and with economic thinking. But I think there's a sense in which these issues have failed to be taken seriously, and that helps explain some of the alienation that people feel from a lot of political and economic thinking. And I think this broadening of perspective also ends up having quite far-reaching practical implications for the kinds of economic policies that we might pursue. In particular, I think it points towards a much stronger focus on the sphere of production, on questions about the nature and quality of work. And in that sense, it kind of connects with debates at the moment about predistribution, productivism, supply-side progressivism, good jobs. There's a whole sort of set of terms, I think, floating around that try to get at something similar about an economic system that gives citizens opportunities to participate in economic life in a way that supports, not just provides them with enough financial resources, but also with, that helps sustain a sense of self-respect. And in practical terms, I sort of explore three broad areas of policy that might point towards. The first is a broad set of policies that would help raise the wages of lower income and non-college educated workers. I think the education system obviously has a critical role to play here. And there's lots of different aspects of that. I have a discussion I sort of make the case for universal early years education, for a school funding system that's based on need rather than on local wealth. I make the case that we should abolish fee-paying private schools that's more connected to the idea of fair equality of opportunity, but I thought I'd put it out there since it's one of the more controversial ideas in the book. And then when it comes to higher education, I think that Rawls's difference principle points us towards the importance of a shift of focus from academic higher education and towards the more than half of the population who don't go to university. And that I think some of the justifications for the focus on higher education are based on the idea that investing in higher education will generate more economic growth, and that in turn some of the benefits of that will sort of trickle down to those who don't go to university. And in that sense, I think that the focus on higher education is it is kind of the educational equivalent of trickle-down economics, and that if we take seriously the emphasis on giving people access to meaningful work and productive opportunities, that points us towards a much stronger focus on those who don't go to university. That in practical terms, that means that at the very least, public subsidies should be made available on equal terms to those who want to follow a vocational route, whereas often those sort of routes have been left under-financed. And actually, the UK has kind of implemented something that moves quite a long way in that direction through what's known as a lifelong learning entitlement that's going to be introduced from 2025, that will provide every individual with financial support for 4 years of education post-18, that covers both long and short courses and vocational and academic ones in an equal way. So yeah, I think education has a particularly important role to play in a kind of strategy for raising the wages of lower income workers. I also talk about a wider set of labour market institutions that would shift the balance of power between workers and owners, including minimum wages and sector-based collective bargaining. And I think I won't say anything more about them there, just so that I make sure we leave enough time for discussion. The sort of second pillar is about trying to bring about a more equal distribution of wealth. I think that there are sort of small policies like guaranteed minimum interest rates for small savers, or tax breaks to encourage employee share ownership that would encourage more saving, higher savings amongst those with lower incomes. But that if we really want to make a difference when it comes to the distribution of wealth, we should be open to more radical policies like a universal minimum inheritance, which would be paid to every citizen at the age of 18 or 21, or some form of citizens' wealth fund where the state would buy shares in private companies and other assets and then distribute the proceeds to citizens on an equal basis. And that, in a kind of ideal Rawlsian society, either of those schemes might exist on a sort of very substantial scale. That one of the thinkers that the economic thinkers that Rawls was particularly influenced by was the economist James Mead. And Mead actually argued for a citizens' wealth fund that would, in the long run, account for about 50% of national wealth. And I think that it's not impossible that these principles might ultimately point you in a direction that is kind of that radical a shift to the way that we organize our economic system. And Mead, like Rawls, justifies that policy on the basis that it would be consistent with maintaining a thriving and dynamic market economy, but it would really take seriously the challenge of making sure that the benefits are widely distributed. So the third and final pillar, after raising wages, a more equal distribution of wealth, is shifting the balance of power between workers and owners through by adopting something like the German model of co-determination or co-management, where workers and owners share power on much more equal terms through a combination of workers on boards and works councils, which have legal rights to, depending on the sort of the nature of the question, either to being consulted or to being provided with information from companies, all the way through to having a veto power over various decisions that companies make about how workplaces are organized. And I think this kind of model has some advantages to trades unions as a way of shifting the balance of power between workers and owners, that rather than leaving this to individual bargaining within each workplace, it would establish this as a fundamental right that would apply equally across our economic sphere. And also that, unlike unions, this would be a fully democratic system where every worker would have a right to elect representatives to the board or to the works council, and not just the workers who are members of the unions. I think there's also now a growing body of evidence, including some of which has been produced by people at Berkeley. Benjamin Schofer and then with his colleague Simon Yeager have written some great papers recently on co-determination, which show that the sort of conventional economic worries that co-determination would deter investment haven't materialized, and that there really is very little overall relationship between firms that have co-management or co-determination systems in place and a whole suite of measures of company performance, that there's no obvious negative impact on longevity, on profits, on revenues, or on investment, and that actually the most kind of well-designed studies that try to get some sense of causal effects tend to find more positive impacts of co-determination. So for example, in a paper that looked at workers on boards in a German context, looking at companies that sort of fall either side of a particular threshold, found that companies that did have worker representation on boards actually have higher investment than their counterparts with weaker co-management institutions. So again, I think that there's, part of what the book is trying to do is both think about institutions that would be desirable on the basis of broadly Rawlsian policies, but also to argue that they are feasible based on the evidence, that these are institutions that we could put into practice that would be likely to achieve their aims and not to generate all sorts of unintended consequences. Okay, that's the kind of overview of some of the practical ideas in the book. There's obviously lots more to say about all of those things. I don't think that the policy ideas in the book, they don't follow in a sort of deductive way from Rawls's principles. They're based on a kind of on an assessment of the evidence, and I think there's plenty of room for debate about all of them. And I think what we get from Rawls, though, is it's more a framework for having that debate than a kind of rigid and fixed set of answers. I thought I would just finish with a couple of comments on how I see the sort of relationship between these ideas and real politics. I suppose first, the policies, the way I've thought about the policy program that I tried to set out in the book has been to follow Rawls's idea of a realistic utopia, to think about the best that institutions could be given the realities of human nature and how we think those institutions would actually work in practice, but putting questions about political feasibility to the side. And I think that having that kind of long-term vision it's sort of valuable in its own right. And I think it's important to do that so that, because I think it's important to do that because ultimately what's politically achievable is not fixed in advance. It depends both on what people think is desirable and what they think is feasible. And, the book is really addressed to both of those questions, to try to make a persuasive argument that these kinds of policies that might sometimes feel outside of the sort of window of what's politically feasible, politically achievable right now, are desirable, that they follow from, I think, widely held liberal principles, and that they're feasible, that they're consistent with the evidence that we have on the basis both of institutions that already exist in some countries and other other evidence from the social scientists, which I try to sort of draw on in the book. So the second thing is that, I think what we get from Rawls is not just a list of policy ideas. And, in a sense, part of the aim of the book is to try to show how a wide range of policy ideas, many of which will already be familiar to lots of people, can be drawn together into a more coherent whole. And I think that's really what sort of bringing Rawls to the conversation has to offer. And I think what we get from Rawls then is not just a sort of set of policies, but a set of guiding values. And I think thinking about politics that it's important not to underestimate the roles that values play in people's decisions about how to vote, that people don't just vote on the basis of their individual self-interest. There's lots of studies in political science about this, that they also vote on the basis of their values and identities, and that those values and identities shape their understanding of their interests. And I think that in a world where traditional party loyalties are weaker than ever, in which more and more people are, the rate at which people shift their political allegiances from one election to the next is higher than it has been before, that a kind of clarity of vision in relation to values is really more important than ever in enabling political parties to build broad and durable coalitions. And I think there's a sort of lesson that we can take there from the experience of third way parties like the Democrats under Bill Clinton and New Labour under Tony Blair, that a sort of more pragmatic and technocratic approach to politics that tries to triangulate positions and aim at a kind of centrist voter, that kind of strategy can be quite effective in the short term, but can come at the cost of undermining some of the sense of party identity and loyalty that is important for sustaining coalitions over the longer run. The third final thing I thought I would say is just that I think Rawls is, so that, that having a clear sense of values seems like something that is important for sustaining and building durable electoral coalitions, and that Rawls's philosophy in particular offers some advantages for mainstream progressive parties today. First, in the sense that it offers, I think, a genuinely unifying vision that can reach across lines of class, race, and gender, and overcome some of the more divisive aspects of identity politics, but without abandoning the importance of justice for specific groups. And then second, that it offers potentially a viable basis for winning back some of the lower income and lower educated voters that have tended to abandon these parties in recent decades, many of whom have been alienated by the way in which those parties have embraced more neoliberal or market-oriented policies, and that it does that particularly by recognizing the importance to lower income voters, not just of a more equal, of more financial resources, but the importance of questions to do with dignity and respect and the meaning and the importance of work within that. Okay, I think that's pretty much everything I have to say, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
So thanks so much for that. I think it's hard to overstate what an achievement it is to write a book for a more popular audience that imagines possible worlds. So I think in addition to the intellectual value of the book, there's just a tremendous instrumental value of keeping these things alive as something that we think we can actually talk about seriously in public. And writing a book for such a press that sort of is about, that renders Rawls's, intricate arguments, let's say, into kind of crystalline readable prose. So I think it's just a really tremendous accomplishment. And it's also a double honor to have the opportunity to comment on this, and then also at a BESI event. And so it's really wonderful that the wings have fully unfurled, and it's a real treat to be a part of that. So the book, looks to Rawls as an unlikely source of revitalization for progressive politics and liberal democracy in the 2020s. So the core of my comments are going to be around this figuration of liberal democracy as progressive politics. And I think perhaps it's an index of how much the terrain has shifted, that Rawls is, and I think you point this very rightly, is a clarion of economic and political radicalism. Because I think that certainly was not interpreted as being the case in 1971. And so I think that's worth noting. And so what was the nature of Rawls's project? So someone like, say, Marx, the nature of his project was something like shifting socialism from being grounded on rationality to its historical inevitability. And in a funny way, Rawls kind of does the reverse, that a moment when liberal democratic capitalism sort of at its historical apogee, we might argue, he articulates a systematic case for the rationality of this system. So kind of takes the opposite approach. But now, and this kind of I think was what's really motivating the book, is that the historical inevitability of liberal democracy is seriously in question. As some very pithily say, it's the end of history. And so the book is framed explicitly against the rise of anti-liberal populism. And we're obviously in many ways quite far from Rawls's vision of a well-ordered society. And I think there's deeper reasons why the policies explored in the second half of the book feel so far off, despite their urgency, despite their kind of reasonableness, despite the justice motivating them. And so the book positions Rawls as offering a counter to Hayek and Friedman for a distinctively progressive liberalism. So on page 170, that the ethical and philosophical framework of Rawls, which can offer a truly systematic alternative to neoliberalism. And so one of the big questions is that is neoliberalism an ideology, an ethical or philosophical framework, or is it something deeper and darker? That my own view is that there's more than a little neoliberalism in anti-liberal populism. So it's not just that neoliberalism has hollowed out liberal democracy and impoverished our political imaginations, but I think there's a more fundamental continuity. So this is something that Wendy Brown develops in her book In the Ruins, that Hayek and company's thoroughgoing attack on the social is really part of tilling the anti-democratic soil in which these movements have grown, not to mention privatization and all the rest. And then I'd also push that a little further and ask how much liberal democracy is there in neoliberalism? And the answer in my own work is a great deal. That in a sense, we might see the contemporary political moment as marking several deep tensions and unresolved problems within liberal democracy really coming home to roost. And so I would confess that I'm exactly the cynic cum skeptic that I think you addressed in the conclusion. But I would say that my skepticism and my cynicism arises not from a quarrel with the political philosophy or sort of the beautiful way that you've rendered Rawls's thought, but with what I might somewhat tendentiously call the political theory, that it's a vision for liberal democratic capitalism. That's the kind of order that Rawls has in mind. And the cause of my cynicism and skepticism is that I'm not so sure that's the kind of order that we actually live in today. So in that way, my concern is that Rawls doesn't really help us understand how and why that original project went awry, because it's diagnosing or trying to further the aims of political order that I think in more ways than we'd like to admit is importantly unlike our own. And I think achieving his political vision would primarily require understanding those problems rather than philosophically recommitting to sort of the principles of justice and promulgating policies that derive from them, however important and urgent and essential that those are. But at the same time, I'm acutely aware of how severely circumscribed our political economic horizons have become. And again, think that there's just tremendous value of imagining possible futures, whatever, kind of quarrels you might have with some specific aspects of those possible futures. So then to restate it, that the basic problem, I guess, is that Rawls's political philosophy is for a world unlike our own. That, in the triad of liberal democratic capitalism, which I'll explore in a moment, to put it again in Rawlsian terms, is his basic structure our basic structure? Are his core institutions our core institutions? And this is, I think, where the cynicism and skepticism comes from. So to take the first, democracy, right? So the status of the United States as a democracy that Sheldon Wolin once observed is more of an unquestioned assumption, he said, rather than a matter of public discussion. And as the book very rightly notes, that political equality is the essential core of democracy. And certainly we have elections in the United States, as I think all of us know a little too well, but that's not exactly to say that it is a democracy. So in comparative politics, for instance, the rubric that I think is kind of the median among scholars of comparative politics they use as assessing whether or not a regime can be said to be democratic is, do majorities of the people, either directly or through their representatives, direct the government in accordance with their preferences and desires? And if you sort of go through the three branches of government in the United States, to say nothing of the Pentagon, the Federal Reserve, the Postal Service, I think the answer is pretty emphatically no. Certainly that is not the case for the executive. Certainly that is not the case for the judicial. You have well-established problems with gerrymandering in the House. And then, of course, the Senate is based on the states, which is take the same problem of gerrymandering and you make it exponentially more severe. And guidelines at Page have shown that popular opinion just does not translate into policy at the federal level. Right? So in this kind of fundamental sense, I mean, do we really live in a democratic system? And then liberalism, right? How liberal are we? So on page 127, you write that no matter how well we design our constitutional structures, in the end, a liberal democracy can survive and flourish only if citizens share certain basic political values and if they're willing to defend the institutions that realize them when they come under attack. And liberalism has always had a little bit of a double life. There's the liberalism of something like the Universal Declaration of Human Life, and then there's the liberalism of, say, a John Locke or a John Calhoun, right? The virulent defender of slavery, but yet also kind of in some kind of ambiguous sense a liberal, arguing for kind of individual liberty and protection from state interference. And Jefferson Cowie has a great book kind of about this that just came out recently. So is the liberalism that we have in the United States, is it about equal liberties for all, or is it really about unlimited license of the proprietor, right? That in Locke's Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina, prescribing the number of whips that you're supposed to give an indentured servant for misaddressing one of the sort of patrician classes of South Carolina in his imagination. And I think part of the crisis of the moment is that it just seems that majorities of voters in the advanced industrial democracies are increasingly turning away from liberalism as a political philosophy. And that given the choice between somewhat illusory promises of material security on the one hand and liberal political freedom and equality on the other, it seems increasingly that voters are choosing one over the other, right? About defending our way of life from outsiders becomes paramount and not so much sort of living as free and equal citizens. And then this is sort of a separate line, but as a liberal, Rawls must assume that private social powers of all kinds remain fundamentally private. And this is kind of the core of the conflict that he has with Susan Miller-Oken and Charles Mills also picks up on in different ways, that there's just certain powers that just must kind of remain outside of the political. And that's kind of a fundamental aspect of liberal political orders. And then Sheldon Wolin makes a kind of related critique that Rawls's concept of the political is small enough, or it's too constrained. So then democracy becomes less about a robust practices of governing and shaping or collective conditions of existence, but more of a legitimizing wrapper for a somewhat immovable liberalism. And then finally, how capitalist are we, right? I mean, how much of the economy in the United States is organized by competitive markets? It's debatable, I would argue, not the majority, right? If you're talking about, say, housing, healthcare, education, automobiles, financial services, right? How many competitive markets do we really have? And that unlike Hayek or Friedman, Rawls is not an economist. And he, in my view, somewhat naively imports his economic theory from Samuelson and Arrow and others. And I think there's kind of important limitations that importation means. So in a way, it makes his philosophical system, making the sort of inner workings of the philosophical system depends on committing to the somewhat stringent assumptions of neoclassical economic theory, which seems to prejudice in favor of a certain kind of neoliberal policymaking. And then in my own study of Rawls, it's somewhat of a puzzle of why Rawls never really cites Keynesian economics. That he looks at the treatise on probability a few times, but Keynesian economics, kind of the great, the godfather of post-war welfare states in a sense, is never really treated in his thought. So it brings us back to sort of assessing what's at stake in this relationship between neoliberalism, anti-liberal populism, and the Rawlsian alternative presented in the book. Right, so is the United States, or even maybe the United Kingdom as well, a liberal democratic capitalist order that has gone astray, or is it something else entirely whose foundational commitments are being revealed? And I think the answer to this question bears crucially on why neoliberalism triumphed over post-war social democracy and the possibilities for Rawlsian renewal on that basis. So I don't think it's simply that Friedman and Hayek won the philosophical argument while Thatcher and Reagan won the political argument, but there's some deeper problems at work there, which get into now. And I think on a historical lens, post-war social democracy did not rest on a broad political consensus, or as it turns out, a secure institutional foundation. When we think of the great triumphs of the period, that those were essentially elite projects imposed by Congress and the courts that were sort of tremendously politically unpopular at the time. And this was the opening that Nixon and then later Reagan would really capitalize on. And so I'd say arguably today what we're seeing is sort of many of those subsequent détentes kind of unraveling. So then just to move into the conclusion, I mean, what can Rawls's, what you called it, truly universal moral vision offer a world where universalism seems to be receding in many different respects, or to orders that perhaps like our own are not strictly speaking liberal democracies? And so once we set that kind of presumption of being, having the basic structure like what Rawls describes of being a liberal democracy in this way aside, it then becomes a little less surprising how Donald Trump could be kind of a slight favorite for the presidency once again, or that the world seems inching closer to a kind of state of war. And perhaps like our philosophical forebears, it may not be enough to just kind of make sound philosophical argument. but we must also wait for history to create the conditions for meaningful political and economic change. And so to the extent that we are not a liberal democracy in the way we usually like to imagine, I'm not sure that Rawls' own work illuminates the obstacles to realizing his own vision, however attractive and urgent that vision may be. But again, the quarrel is with Rawls largely and not with the really excellent book. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Brian. I think given the time, it might be a good idea to just, I know I'm sure you have stuff that you want to say, but maybe we collect 2 or 3 comments from the audience.
Right.
And then give you a chance to answer Brian.
Yeah.
Thank you for the book, which I regret to confess I have not yet read, but now greatly looking forward to doing so. And it has been many years since I read The Theory of Justice, but something which, in my hearing, I'm a cognitive psychologist, that's my full disclosure, might tie together the skepticism or cynicism that was expressed in response. Going back to Rawls' sort of fundamental principles, the reason that a system based on his approach might have grave difficulty being translated into practical application, as I'm looking forward to reading your proposal about doing that, is because there is a level on which the fundamental assumptions are sort of ignore radically human nature. And I'll just give one example and try to do it quick. Years ago, it struck me that the thought experiment of the veil of ignorance profoundly ignores the fact that there are profound inter-individual differences in tolerance for risk. People who have a higher tolerance for risk will be willing to wager under the, from the veil of ignorance that they'll be able to do a little better, whereas other people will prefer not to do that. And that sort of personality difference, which is deeply rooted in evolutionary psychology, is likely to affect people's attitudes towards the systems which may, from a rational perspective, provide the advantages that Rawls claims, but it's very difficult to implement them in practice because of people's attitudes and behavioral tendencies, which are shaped by deep forces, the same evolutionary forces that control whether there's a possibility of social altruism at all. So I'm wondering whether, in order to make the translation that you're describing, even in your talk, whether there is a need to take sort of social behavioral factors into account and not only to work out the implications of the theoretical analysis which underlies. I hope that's not.
Yeah.
I love this book. So you said that Rawls provides us with a framework more than answers, and that he gives us a way to frame these debates. I mean, I think that's exactly right. And maybe I'm attaching too much to the language, but I also heard you say that that would give us like a relatively coherent program or a unifying vision. So I guess my abstract version of my question is, since it's a relatively permissive set of ideas, doesn't necessarily lead us to a coherent program or a unifying vision. And I guess my very specific version of the same question is, I was thinking about universal basic income, and it just seemed to me that there was some tension between maybe the arguments that you were making for that versus a fairly deep acceptance of the merits of markets at some level that I think is both in Rawls and in you. Not that they, not that they're always great, but that there's something there about their coordinating mechanism and the efficiency and incentives. And also attention to another piece of the argument, which is about kind of the value of paid work, of the meaning of work as itself. Yeah, so I don't mean this as an accusation. I'm just trying to say, like, it's actually not that easy to put these principles into a coherent program, and whether you see that or not.
Calling myself, and then we'll come back to you.
Okay.
So I wanted to ask what I think is a fairly grounded question, but that maybe links to Brian's commentary. So British Labour just won a thumping victory. Conservatives' worst electoral showing, I think, in the history of the party. And yet, it's, from what little I know, it seems like their policy agenda is very far from the kinds of things that you imagine in the book. And I guess I just wonder what you make of, if maybe that's not right, you can tell me it's not right, but if it is right, like, what do you make of that in terms of why the distance between what a center-left party, like under condition, like, an American center-left party would be ecstatic to have the kinds of, like, there's, Parliament can do what it wants, pretty much, right? You've got a majority, you can do what you want. That's never true in the same way in the US. And yet it seems like even with that free reign, most of the stuff that you're talking about is just way off the political agenda. And I'm just curious what you make of that.
Okay, lots to think about. So just quickly to respond to some of what Brian said, I guess, I think I don't see it as a problem for the usefulness of Rawls's theory that our actually existing societies are at least very imperfect liberal democracies. I think, whether it's better, whether there still are liberal democracies in some sense or not, institutionally, I think it's hard to know exactly where to draw the line. I think what the important assumption that's the basis for Rawls's theory being a useful one politically is not that our institutions reflect his actual principles, but that citizens generally share some of the basic intuitions that his theory is working with. So that, the really fundamental assumption is that people are willing to think about society as a fair system of cooperation, that they want to find a way to justify the institutions that exist to their fellow citizens, that they recognize that as being a core part of what it is to live in a democratic society. And, I think if most people rejected that very basic idea, then I think Rawls's philosophy wouldn't have very much to offer us in this present moment. But I wish I could sort of marshal good evidence to suggest that it's definitely the case. But I think that the core intuitions that Rawls is working with, both at that sort of very general level of wanting to be able to justify policies to others, and also some of the specific principles that he articulates to do with individual freedom, political equality, equality of opportunity, some kind of notion of shared prosperity. I think there are principles that many people do subscribe to, and that I suppose that's part, I think the sort of what Rawls's philosophy tries to do is to identify the ideals that lots of people share, use them as a basis for beginning a conversation about what institutions look like, and that is useful because people see that there's a gap between the principles that they adhere to and the way that institutions are organized. And so I think maybe I may just have misunderstood the nature of the critique, but to me, the fact that our institutions don't live up to his principles, that we don't live in a democracy in the way that he would describe it, that the kind of capitalism that we have doesn't adhere to his principles very closely. I'm not sure how that undermines the usefulness of his ideas right now, as long as people as long as people are sort of willing to see the ideals that Rawls is aiming at as useful ones, that sort of gives the ideas some purchase. Yeah, and I mean, I suppose I agree that just making the right philosophical arguments is not enough. And I guess the step that the book tries to go beyond that is to also marshal empirical arguments behind particular policies. But I also, I think that's one thing, to sort of have an argument about desirability and practical achievability. I think those are kind of necessary but not sufficient. And that ultimately, for these ideas to have a kind of wider political impact, they need to be taken up in the political sphere in ways that might look very different to exactly how they're sort of found in the book. So yeah, I don't know if I'm sure there's much more to say. I need to think more, but those are my sort of first reflections. On the question about whether the theory ignores some basic realities of human psychology, I think, well, the first thing I think I would want to defend the basic realism of Rawls's theory in terms of an account of the kind of moral psychology, in the sense that it's grounded in, I think the sort of the core idea is one of reciprocity, that people are willing to interact with others in ways that can be mutually beneficial and fair, and that sort of core commitment to reciprocity. And I think Rawls sort of distinguishes reciprocity as the kind of foundational psychological principle of his theory from utilitarianism, which he takes to be based on a psychology of altruism. And I think that, in terms of I think there is, and I wish I had been able to get into this in the book, and I'm sort of sad that I didn't, and would like to pick it up another time. But there is a bit, broad literature that shows that a general instinct towards reciprocity and fairness is something that's very deeply wired in our moral psychology. Both, we see that in studies of evolutionary psychology and also in lab experiments. And so I think on that level, the importance of reciprocity is the kind of foundational psychological assumption over either altruism or self-interest is, I think that sort of puts Rawls's philosophy on a more secure footing than some of the alternatives. I suppose if you think of utilitarianism being based on altruism and a kind of neoliberalism being based on a sort of the assumption that self-interest is the overriding kind of driver of human behavior and human society. I think then when it comes to the original position thought experiment, I think is very explicitly, in the way that Rawls describes it, not meant to be an account of the actual psychology of sort of, yeah, it's not meant to be a description of human psychology. It's a very artificial thought experiment that's meant to capture something that people find intuitive about the idea of fairness. And the sort of specific critique about whether the argument for his principles depends on assumptions about risk aversion, I think that, in a way that would sort of gets too much. I'm just looking at the clock and thinking will get sort of too much into the weeds of the detail of the argument. But I think it's basically that in the evolution of Rawls's writing, he tried to move away. I think the argument made in A Theory of Justice did make some assumptions about risk aversion, and I think Rawls recognized that was a mistake and tried to revise those arguments in later work. And I think in doing so, he sort of strengthened the kind of internal argument for why the thought experiment justifies the principles in an important way. But I think even if that still, I think that the more fundamental psychological assumption is connected to reciprocity and fairness rather than a sort of deep commitment to a particular position in terms of risk aversion. Steve's question about, about how it can be both a framework and the sort of basis for a coherent vision. How, I suppose I think that Rawls gives us a framework, and I guess what I think the way that that framework is useful, the way that it works or should work in the real world, is that then people have to make specific arguments about what that framework implies. That's the way in which it is a framework for debate, is that for it to become a framework for debate, people have to put forward different positions about what the principles imply. And so I suppose that the second part of the book is an attempt to do that, to set out one interpretation of where the principles might lead on the basis of both a particular interpretation of the principles and of the evidence about the institutions that I'm arguing for. And that hopefully then is the basis for, other people can then respond to it. But I think that the framework only becomes useful once people start to make specific commitments about what it implies. I suppose that's at least how I sort of think about the relationship between the two things. And universal basic income, I do make the case for a universal basic income in the book. The reasoning behind that is connected to the importance of self-respect within Rawls's theory, that if all we were concerned with was making sure that everyone could meet their basic needs, and it's from a principle of basic needs rather than the difference principle that the argument for a basic income is made. What was I going to say? Sorry. So yeah, but basically I think, because since I don't have much time, I think, one of the reasons why I didn't mention the basic income argument today is that I think it's of all the policies in the book, it's the one that has the sort of, where the balance of arguments is most kind of finely, it's not so decisive. I think there is a Rawlsian argument to be made for a universal basic income. I think part of the appeal of it is that it is consistent with the importance of markets, and part of the appeal is that alongside forms of workplace democracy, it offers a decentralized mechanism for trying to change the world of work, and that those two things can work powerfully together, that a basic income kind of strengthens in the sort of Hirschman exit voice loyalty framework, that you have the workers have a stronger power through forms of exit, through a basic income, and that workplace democracy provides voice, and that together those can be I think in that way, universal basic income isn't meant to be an alternative to taking a serious, to being interested, to recognizing the importance of work, but part of a broad package that tries to change work in a way that recognizes that it can't be done from the top down. And then, coming to the Labour Party, I suppose a few thoughts. The first is that they do have a complete, an enormous, unprecedented majority, but I think it's also recognized to be a very fragile one, that Labour's actual vote share is amongst the lowest. I think it's the lowest vote share of any, it's a historically low vote share, but because of the first past the post system, they managed to get an enormous parliamentary majority. And I think that, one thought is that Starmer has approached, his pitch to voters was a very technocratic one. I think is distinctively, there's a particular absence of a broader philosophical framework. He just seems instinctively, there was a sort of funny anecdote I heard from someone who wrote a biography of Starmer, where Starmer they're talking about the fact that people are constantly asking Starmer what his vision is, or accusing him of not having one. And his response to that was, if someone comes up to you in the street and asks you what your vision is, you would run a mile and think that they were mad. And he just sort of doesn't seem to get the value of vision in politics. But I wonder if that will begin to change, because pre-election there was constant talk about nobody knowing what Keir Starmer stood for, and that kind of disappeared a bit once there was a manifesto and there was a set of policies, and it seemed like it was perverse to keep saying that when we kind of did know what Keir Starmer stood for. There were lots of individual policies, and that's even more true now that Starmer is in government, and they have a kind of, he's had a King's Speech where he set out his legislative program for the next few years, and yet the question of what Keir Starmer stands for has come back, and I think that is shows that just having policies isn't enough. That voters really, that people want some sense of what it is that a party stands for, that people don't spend their time evaluating the sort of details of policy, and that my hope in a sense is that the return of that question might begin to show Starmer and the Labour Party the political value and not just the intellectual value of shaping some kind of broader vision. And I think that the area where what Keir Starmer has said about his values overlaps best with the kind of Rawlsian agenda that I set out in the book is to do with questions about dignity and respect, that actually in a similar way to Joe Biden, Starmer has talked a lot about those values and made sort of cursory comments about the importance of work in relation to dignity and respect, but hasn't really kind of developed that very much. It feels often like just language, just sort of comes up in a speech, doesn't feel connected to any broader policy agenda. And that, in a sense, that I think that's one of the areas where these ideas feel like they speak most to the present moment. And hopefully part of what the book is trying to do is to connect quite vague language about dignity and respect to a practical agenda that's connected with the importance of work, and which particularly tries to put questions about workplace democracy and co-management back on the agenda as a mechanism for achieving that. So I think that's the area where I see the most overlap is in that sense that redistribution alone isn't enough, that something else is needed, and that Rawls's philosophy can both help kind of give that some grounding, and that the practical ideas in the book can help point towards the policy agenda that might imply in practice.
Right. You're reminding me that the first President Bush used to refer with disdain to the vision thing that he was told that he lacked. So we're out of time. We may not have lifted the veil of ignorance, but you've removed some of our ignorance, and we're grateful for that, Daniel. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.